The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 10, Side 1. Jacopo d'Antonio di Jacopo Tatti was by birth, in 1486, a Florentine. He went very reluctantly to school, says Vasari, but took eagerly to drawing. His mother encouraged this disposition. His father, who had hoped to make a merchant of him, was overruled. So Jacopo went to serve as apprentice to the sculptor Andrea Contucci di Monte Sansovino, who loved the lad so well and taught him so conscientiously that Jacopo came to look upon him as a father and adopted Andrea's cognomen, Sansovino, as his own. The youth had also the good fortune to make a friend of Andrea del Sarto, and perhaps learned from him the secrets of graceful and animated design. While in Florence, the young sculptor carved the Bacchus, now in the Bargello, famous for its perfect balance, and for the skill with which arm, hand, and vase, lightly poised on the fingertips, were cut from one piece of marble. Everyone, except Michelangelo, was kind to Andrea and helped him up the hill to excellence. Giuliano da Sangallo took him to Rome and gave him lodging. Bramante commissioned him to make a wax copy of the Laocoon. It was so well done that it was cast in bronze for Cardinal Grimani. Perhaps through Bramante's influence, Andrea turned from sculpture to architecture and soon received lucrative commissions. He was in Rome when the sack came, and, like many other artists, he lost all his possessions. He made his way to Venice, thinking to go to France, but the Doge Andrea Gritti begged him instead to strengthen the pillars and cupolas of St. Mark's. His work so pleased the Senate that he was made state architect in 1529. For 6 years he labored to improve the Piazza San Marco, banishing the butchers' shops that had sullied the Piazzetta, opening new streets, and helping to make St. Mark's Square the spacious delight that it is today. In 1536 he built the Zecca, or Mint, and began his most celebrated building, the Libreria Vecchia, facing the Palace of the Doges. He designed the facade with a stately double portico of Doric and Ionic columns, handsome cornices and balconies, and decorative statuary. Some have rated this old library the most beautiful profane edifice in Italy, but the multiplication of columns is excessive, and the structure can hardly compare with the Palace of the Doges. In any case, the procurators liked it, raised Sansovino's salary, and exempted him from war taxes. In 1544, one of the main arches collapsed and the vault crashed down. Sansovino was thrown into jail and heavily fined, but Aretino and Titian persuaded the procurators to release and pardon him. The arch and vault were repaired, and the building was successfully completed in 1553. Meanwhile, in 1540, Sansovino had designed the pretty Loggetta, or vestibule for police, on the eastern side of the Campanile, and had adorned it with bronze and terracotta sculptures. In St. Mark's he cast bronze doors for a sacristy, and took occasion to portray among the reliefs not only Aretino, but Titian and himself. The three men had now become firm friends, enviously known in Venetian art circles as the Triumvirate. Many an evening they spent together, talking shop, or entertaining such beauty as could be engaged for the time. Jacopo rivaled Aretino in popularity with women, and Titian in longevity. He remained strong and healthy, and, we are assured, enjoyed perfect eyesight till his 84th year. For 50 years he never consulted a physician. During summers he lived almost entirely on fruit. When Paul III invited him to succeed Antonio da Sangallo as chief architect at St. Peter's, he refused, saying that he would not exchange his life in a republic for service under an absolute ruler. Ercole II of Ferrara and Duke Cosimo of Florence in vain offered him large stipends to take up residence at their courts. He died peacefully in 1570, in the 85th year of his age. In that year appeared an epoch-making work, 4 books of architecture, by Andrea Palladio, who gave his name to a style that endured here and there into our own time. Like so many others, Andrea went to Rome and was thrilled by the ruined grandeur of the Forum. He came to love those broken columns and capitals as the finest conceptions that architecture had ever reached. He almost memorized Vitruvius, and his own book strove to restore to Renaissance building all those principles which, he thought, had created the glory of classic Rome. It seemed to him that the finest architecture would avoid all ornament that did not spring spontaneously from the constructive style itself. It would pledge itself to a strict proportion, connection, and congruity of the parts in an organic whole. It would be classically noble and strong, as chaste as a Vestal Virgin, and as dignified as an emperor. His first major work was his best, and is one of the outstanding structures of secular Italy. Around the Palazzo della Ragione, or town hall of his native Vicenza, he built, beginning in 1549, magnificent and powerful arcades, transforming an undistinguished Gothic core into a Basilica Palladiana that might vie with the Basilica Julia of the Roman Forum itself. A tier of arches sustaining Doric columns and pilasters, a massive architrave, a railing and balcony elegantly carved, a second tier of arches on Ionic columns, a classic cornice and railing, and above each spandrel, a statue rising to oversee the city and give it an exemplar of greatness. I do not question, he wrote in his book 21 years later, but that this fabric may be compared with the ancient edifices and be looked upon as one of the most noble and beautiful buildings erected since the time of the ancients. If he had confined his challenge to civic buildings, the boast might stand. Palladio became the hero of Vicenza, which felt that he had surpassed Sansovino's Libreria Vecchia. Rich men plied him with commissions for palaces and villas, ecclesiastics for churches. Before he died in 1580, he had transformed his city almost into an ancient Roman municipality. He built a loggia for the city administration, a pretty museum, a splendid Teatro Olimpico. Venice called him, and there he designed two of her finest churches, San Giorgio Maggiore and the Redentore. Even before his death, he had become a powerful influence in Italy. Early in the 17th century, Inigo Jones brought the Palladian style into England. It spread through Western Europe and came to America. Perhaps it was a misfortune. It never really captured the dignity of Roman architecture. It confused its facades with a plethora of columns, capitals, cornices, moldings, and statuary. The details detract from the simple lines and clarity of a classic edifice. And by reverting so humbly to an ancient style, Palladio forgot that a living art should express its own epoch and mood, not those of another age. That is why, when we think of the Renaissance, we do not call to mind its architecture, nor even its sculpture, but above all its painting, which bore lightly the traditions of Alexandria and Rome, freed itself from cramping and uncongenial Byzantine molds, and made itself the authentic voice and color of the time. 2. Aretino, 1492 to 1556. To make sure that 1492 would be memorable, Pietro Aretino, scourge of princes and prince of blackmailers, came into the world on Good Friday of that year. His father was a poor shoemaker of Arezzo, known to us only as Luca. Like many other Italians, Pietro received in time the name of his birthplace and became Aretino. His enemies insisted that his mother was a prostitute. He denied it and claimed that his mother was a pretty girl named Tita, who posed as a Madonna for painters, but in a careless moment conceived Pietro while in the arms of a casual but noble lover, Luigi Bacci. Aretino did not mind being a bastard, having such distinguished company in that class, and Luigi's legitimate sons, when Pietro became famous, did not mind his calling them brothers. But his father was Luca. Having attained the maturity of 12 years, he set out to make his fortune. He found work as a bookbinder's assistant in Perugia, and there he studied art sufficiently to become in later years an excellent critic and connoisseur. He himself did some painting. In the chief square of Perugia was a holy picture, fondly reverenced by the people, showing Magdalene fervent at the feet of Christ. One night Aretino painted a lute in the arms of the Magdalene, changing her prayer into a serenade. When the city seethed with anger at the prank, Pietro slipped out of Perugia and examined Italy. He earned his bread as a servant in Rome, as a street singer in Vicenza, as an innkeeper in Bologna. He served a term in the galleys, became a hired man in a monastery, was discharged for lechery, and returned to Rome in 1516. There he labored as a lackey for Agostino Chigi. The banker was not unkindly, but Aretino had discovered his own peculiar genius and fretted under servantry. He wrote a bitter satire describing a scullion's life. Cleaning privies, polishing chamber pots, performing lewd offices for cooks and stewards who soon see to it that he is all pricked out and embroidered with the French disease. He showed his poems to some of Chigi's guests, and word went around that this Pietro was the sharpest and wittiest satirist in Rome. His pieces began to circulate. Pope Leo enjoyed them, sent for the author, laughed at his rough, frank humor, and added him to the papal staff as a cross between poet and jester. For 3 years, Pietro ate well. Suddenly, Leo died, and Aretino was afloat again. As the conclave dallied in choosing a successor, he wrote satires on the electors and the candidates, affixed the sheets to the statue of Pasquino, and poked fun at so many dignitaries that soon he had hardly a friend in the city. When Adrian VI was elected and began a most unwelcome campaign of reform, Pietro fled to Florence, then to Mantua in 1523, where Federigo took him on as court poet at a moderate salary. When the death of Adrian answered Rome's prayers and a rich Medici sat again on the throne of thrones, Pietro, like 1,000 other poets, artists, rascals, and rakes, hurried back to the capital. Almost at once he ended his welcome there. Giulio Romano had painted 20 pictures describing various erotic attitudes. Marcantonio Raimondi made engravings for them. For each engraving, says Vasari, Messer Pietro Aretino wrote an extremely lewd sonnet, so that I cannot say which is worse, the drawings or the words. The pictures and sonnets went the rounds of the intelligentsia. They reached Pope Clement's datary, Ghiberti, who was known to be hostile to Aretino. Pietro heard of it and took again to the road. At Pavia he charmed Francis I, who was on the verge of losing everything but honor. And now, by putting a different point on his pen, he turned a somersault that made Rome gasp. He wrote 3 laudatory poems, one about Clement, one about Ghiberti, one about Federigo. The Marquis said a good word for him to the Pope. Ghiberti relented, Clement sent for Aretino and made him a pensioned Knight of Rhodes. Francesco Berni, his only rival among the satirists, described him at this period. He walks through Rome dressed like a duke. He takes part in all the wild doings of the lords. He pays his way with insults couched in tricked-up words. He talks well, and he knows every libelous anecdote in the city. The Estes and the Gonzagas walk arm in arm with him and listen to his prattle. He treats them with respect and is haughty to everyone else. He lives on what they give him. His gifts as a satirist make people afraid of him, and he revels in hearing himself called a cynical, impudent slanderer. All that he needed was a fixed pension. He got one by dedicating to the Pope a second-rate poem. Aretino would not have questioned any of this. As if to illustrate it, he asked the Mantuan ambassador to solicit for him from Federigo 2 pairs of shirts worked with gold, 2 pairs worked in silk, together with 2 golden caps. When these took too much time in coming, he threatened to annihilate the Marquis with a diatribe. The ambassador warned Federigo, "Your Excellency knows his tongue, therefore I will say no more." Soon 4 shirts worked in gold arrived, and 4 of silk, and 2 gold caps, and 2 silk hats. Aretino, wrote the ambassador, is satisfied. Pietro could now really dress like a duke. This second period of Roman prosperity was ended by a cloak-and-dagger romance. Aretino composed an insulting sonnet on a young woman employed in the datary's kitchen. Another of Ghiberti's household, Achille della Volta, attacked Aretino in the street at 2 o'clock in the morning in 1525, stabbed him twice in the chest and so severely in the right hand that 2 fingers had to be cut off. The wounds were not mortal. Aretino healed rapidly. He demanded the arrest of Achille, but neither Clement nor his datary intervened. Pietro suspected the datary of planning to have him murdered, and he decided that the time had come for another Italian tour. He moved to Mantua and resumed his service with Federigo in 1525. A year later, hearing that Giovanni delle Bandenere was marshalling a force to check Frundsberg's invasion, a secret atom of nobility stirred in him. He rode 100 miles to join Giovanni at Lodi. All the ink in his veins tingled at the thought that he, the poor poet, might become a man of action, might even carve out for himself a principality and be himself a prince, and no mere literary menial of a prince. And indeed, the young commander, as generous as Don Quixote, promised to make him a marquis at least. But brave Giovanni was killed, and Aretino, putting aside the helmet he had received, returned to Mantua and his pen. He composed now a mock judizio, or almanac, for 1527, predicting absurd or evil fates for those he disliked. Furious against Clement for giving Giovanni delle Bandenere inadequate and vacillating support, Aretino included the Pope among the victims of his satire. Clement expressed surprise that Federigo should harbor so irreverent an enemy of the papacy. Federigo gave Aretino 100 crowns and advised him to get out of the papal reach. "I will go to Venice," said Pietro. "Only in Venice does justice hold the scales with an even balance." He arrived in March 1527 and took a house on the Grand Canal. He was fascinated by the views across the lagoon and by the teeming traffic of what he called the fairest highway in the world. "I have determined," he wrote, "to live in Venice forever." He addressed a letter of lordly compliments to the Doge Andrea Gritti, praising the majestic beauty of Venice, the justice of her laws, the security of her people, the asylum she offered to political and intellectual refugees. And he added magnificently, "I, who have stricken terror into kings, give myself to you, fathers of your people." The Doge took him at his own estimate, assured him of protection, assigned him a pension, and interceded for him with the Pope. Though invitations were to come to Aretino from several foreign courts, he remained a loyal resident of Venice throughout his remaining 29 years. The furniture and art that he gathered into his new home attested the power of his pen, for they were given or made possible by the generosity or timidity of his patrons. Tintoretto himself painted the ceiling of Pietro's private apartments. Soon the walls shone with pictures by Titian, Sebastiano del Piombo, Giulio Romano, Bronzino, Vasari. There were statues by Jacopo Sansovino and Alessandro Vittoria. A rich ebony casket contained the letters received by Aretino from princes, prelates, captains, artists, poets, musicians, and noble dames. Later he would publish these letters in 2 volumes totaling 875 closely printed pages. There were carved chests and chairs, and a walnut bed fit for Pietro's now ample form. Amid that art and luxury, Aretino lived and dressed literally like a lord, dispersing charity to the neighborhood poor, entertaining a host of friends, and a succession of mistresses. Where did he get the means to support so lavish a life? Partly from the sale of his writings to publishers, partly from gifts and pensions sent him by men and women who feared his scorn and sought his praise. The satires, poems, letters, and plays that rushed from his pen were bought by the most alert or important people in Italy, all eager to see what he had to say about personalities and events, and delighting in his blasts at the corruption, hypocrisy, oppression, and immorality of the times. Ariosto inserted into the 1532 edition of Orlando Furioso 2 lines that added 2 titles to Pietro's name. Ecco il flagello dei principi, il divin Pietro Aretino. Behold the scourge of princes, the divine Pietro Aretino. Soon it became the fashion to speak of the coarsest and most scurrilous major writer of the age as divine. His renown was continental. His satires were at once translated into French. A bookseller on the Rue Saint-Jacques in Paris made a fortune retailing them. They were welcomed in England, Poland, Hungary. Aretino and Machiavelli, said a contemporary, were the only Italian authors read in Germany. In Rome, where his favorite victims lived, his writings were sold out on the day of their publication. If we may take his own estimate, his receipts from various publications amounted to 1,000 crowns, or about $12,500 a year. Moreover, in 18 years, the alchemy of my pen has drawn over 25,000 gold crowns from the entrails of various princes. Kings, emperors, dukes, popes, cardinals, sultans, pirates were among his tributaries. Charles V gave him a collar worth 300 crowns, Philip II another worth 400, Francis I a still more costly chain. Francis and Charles competed for his favor with promises of fat pensions. Francis promised more than he gave. "I adored him," said Aretino, "but never to get money from the stirring of his liberality is enough to cool the furnaces of Murano," the suburb where the glass industry of Venice was concentrated. A knighthood was offered him without income. He refused it, remarking that a knighthood without revenue is like a wall without forbidden signs. Everybody commits nuisances there. So Pietro pledged his pen to Charles and served him with unwonted fidelity. He was invited to meet the emperor at Padua. On reaching that city, he was hailed by a crowd like a modern celebrity. Charles, out of all those present, chose Aretino to ride beside him through the city and told him, "Every gentleman in Spain knows all your writings. They read everything of yours as fast as it is printed." That night, at a state banquet, the son of the shoemaker sat at the emperor's right hand. Charles invited him to Spain. Pietro refused, having discovered Venice. Sitting beside the conqueror of Italy, Aretino was the first example of what was later called the power of the press. Nothing like his influence would appear again in literature until Voltaire. His satires hardly hold our attention today, for their force lay mostly in pointed allusion to local events too tied to the time to have lasting significance. They were popular because it is hard for us not to enjoy the excoriation of others, because they exposed real abuses and courageously attacked the great and powerful, and because they brought all the resources of the language of the streets to the uses of literature and gainful literary homicide. Aretino exploited the human interest in sex and sin by writing ragionamenti, conversations, among prostitutes about the secrets and practices of nuns, wives, and courtesans. The title page announced the book as The Dialogues of Nana and Antonio, composed by the divine Aretino for his pet monkey Capriccio and for the correction of the 3 states of women, given to the printer in this month of April 1533 in the illustrious city of Venice. Aretino here anticipates the rollicking ribaldry and epithetic frenzy of Rabelais. He revels in 4-letter words and achieves some startling phrases. I'd wager my soul against a pistachio nut. And he indites such lovely descriptions as that of the pretty wife of 17, the finest little piece of flesh that I think I ever saw, who, married to a man of 60, took to sleepwalking as a way of jousting with the lances of the night. The conclusions to which the dialogues come is that courtesans are the most praiseworthy of the 3 classes of women, for the wives and nuns are faithless to their vows, while the courtesans live up to their professions and give an honest night's labor for their pay. Italy was not shocked. It laughed with delight. Now, too, Aretino composed the most popular of his plays, La Cortigiana, The Courtesan. Like most Italian comedies of the Renaissance, it followed the Plautine tradition of servants making fools of their masters, arranging intrigues for them, serving as their panders and their brains. But Aretino added something of his own, his burlesque and bawdy humor, his intimacy with prostitutes, his hatred of courts, above all of the papal court, and his uninhibited transcript of life as he had seen it in the brothels and palaces of Rome. He laid bare the hypocrisies, time-serving, humiliations, flatteries required of the courtier. And in a famous line he defined slander as telling the truth. It was his pithy apologia for his life. In another Aretino comedy, Talanta, the title character is again a prostitute, and the story turns on the tricks she plays upon her 4 lovers and her ways of squeezing money out of their agitation. Another play, Ipocrita, was an Italian Tartuffe. Indeed, Molière is a French continuation of the Aretine comedies, deodorized and improved. In the same year that produced these idols of the stews, Aretino composed a long series of religious works, The Humanity of Christ, the 7 Penitential Psalms, The Life of the Virgin Mary, The Life of the Virgin Catherine, The Life of St. Thomas, Lord of Aquino, etc. They were largely compounded of fiction, and Pietro confessed that they were poetical lies, but they won him the plaudits of the pious, even of the virtuous Vittoria Colonna. In some quarters he was regarded as a pillar of the church. There was talk of making him a cardinal. It was probably his letters that sustained his fame as well as his fortune. Many of these were eulogies addressed to the eulogized, or to persons near them. They were frankly intended to elicit gifts, pensions, or other favors. Sometimes they specified what was to be given and when. Aretino printed these letters almost as soon as he wrote them. This was necessary to their extractive power. Italy snapped them up because they provided an indirect intimacy with famous men and women, and because they were written with an originality, vivacity, and force unequaled by any other writer of the day. Aretino had style without seeking it. He laughed at the bembos who polished their stanzas into perfect lifelessness. He ended the humanist idolatry of Latin, of correctness, and grace. Pretending to be ignorant of literature, he felt free from cramping exemplars. He accepted in his writing one overruling rule: to announce spontaneously, in direct and simple language, his experience and criticism of life and the needs of his wardrobe and larder. Amid the mountain of hypocritical rubbish of these letters, some diamonds can be found. Tender epistles to a favorite ailing harlot, lusty accounts of his domestic history, a sunset described in a letter to Titian almost as brilliantly as Titian or Turner could paint it, and a letter to Michelangelo suggesting, for the Last Judgment, a design much more appropriate than that which the artist used. Aretino's understanding and appreciation of art were among the better qualities of his character. His most intimate male friends were Titian and Sansovino. Together they had many a feast, usually graced with feminine company, usually venal, and there, when the talk turned on art, Aretino could hold his own. His letters sang the praises of Titian to a host of possible patrons and won Vecelli several lucrative commissions, in which Pietro may have shared. It was Aretino who persuaded the Doge, the Emperor, and the Pope to sit to Titian for portraits. Titian painted Aretino twice, and each time made a masterpiece of mountainous and vulgar vitality. Sansovino, pretending to carve an apostle, placed the old satyr's head on a sacristy door in St. Mark's, and perhaps Michelangelo, in the Last Judgment, portrayed him as St. Bartholomew. He was both better and worse than he was painted. He had almost every vice and was accused of sodomy. His hypocrisy made his own Hypocrita seem by comparison sincere. His language, when he set his mind to it, could be a cloaca maxima of filth. He could be brutal and unmanly as when he gloated over the fallen Clement, but he had the grace to write later, "I am ashamed that in censuring him I did so in the depth of his afflictions." He was physically an unabashed coward, but he had the courage to denounce powerful persons and highly cherished abuses. His most visible virtue was generosity. He gave to his friends and the poor a large part of what he received in pensions, earnings, gifts, and bribes. He waived royalties on his published letters so that they might be sold more cheaply and acquire wider fame and higher value. He was annually near bankruptcy with Christmas giving. Giovanni delle Bande Nere said to Guicciardini, "I yield to no man in generosity, unless it be to Messer Pietro, when he has means." He helped his friends to sell their pictures and, as in the case of Sansovino, to get release from jail. "Everybody comes to me," he wrote, "as if I were a custodian of the royal treasury. Let a poor girl be confined, and my house pays the expenses. Let anyone be put into prison, and the cost falls upon me. Soldiers without equipment, strangers down on their luck, stray cavaliers without number, come to my house to refit." If at times he had 22 women in his house, it was not that they constituted his harem. Some were nursing unexpected infants and found a refuge under his roof. We note that a bishop sent him shoes for one of these women. Many of the women whom he used or succored loved and honored him. 6 favored courtesans proudly called themselves Aretines. He had whatever virtue is implied by abundant animal spirits. In private, he was a good-natured animal who had never learned a moral code. He thought, with some excuse in those times, that no person of any consequence had any real moral code. He told Vasari that he had never seen a maiden whose features did not betray a touch of sensuality. His own sensuality was gross, but to his friends it appeared to be merely the spontaneous exuberance of life. Hundreds of people found him lovable. Princes and priests delighted in his conversation. He had no education, but he seemed to know everybody and everything. He became human in his love for Giovanni delle Bande Nere, for Caterina and the 2 children she bore him, and for frail, consumptive, gracious, faithless Pierina Riccia. She came into his household as the 14-year-old wife of his secretary. They lived with him, and he played father to her. Soon he loved her with a consuming and solicitous paternal affection. He reformed his morals, kept of his mistresses only Caterina and their babe Adria. Then, just as he was simmering down to respectability, a Venetian nobleman whose wife he had charmed accused him in court of blasphemy and sodomy. He denied the charges but dared not face the exposures and chances of trial. Conviction would have meant long imprisonment or death. He fled from his house and hid for weeks with friends. They persuaded the court to dismiss the charges. Aretino returned to his home in triumph, cheered by crowds on both sides of the Grand Canal. But he was heartbroken to find in Pierina's eyes that she thought him guilty. Then Pierina's husband deserted her. When she came to Pietro for consolation, he made her his mistress. She developed tuberculosis and for 13 months was near death. He nursed her with anxious tenderness and brought her back to health. At the height of his devotion, she left him for a younger lover. He tried to convince himself that it was better so, but from that day his spirit was broken, and old age advanced upon him triumphantly. He grew fat, but never ceased to vaunt his sexual powers. He frequented brothels and became more and more religious, he who in his youth had laughed at resurrections as nonsense, which only the rabble takes seriously. In 1554 he went to Rome, hoping to be crowned with a red hat, but Julius III could only make him a Knight of St. Peter. In that year he was evicted from the Casa Aretino for failure to pay his rent. He took more modest quarters away from the Grand Canal. 2 years later he died of apoplexy, aged 64. He had confessed some fraction of his sins and had received the Eucharist and extreme unction, and he was buried in the church of San Luca as if he had not been the very paragon and apostle of lechery. A wit composed for him a possible epitaph. Here lies the Tuscan poet Aretino, who evil spoke of everyone but God, giving as his excuse, "I never knew him." 3. Titian and the Kings, 1530 to 1576. In 1530 at Bologna, Aretino introduced Titian to Charles V. The emperor, absorbed in reorganizing Italy, sat impatiently for a portrait and paid the astonished artist a single ducat. Federigo of Mantua, calling Titian the best painter now living, added out of his own pocket a princely 150 ducats to the fee. Gradually, the Duke brought Charles to his own point of view. In 1532, artist and emperor met again. During the next 16 years, Titian painted a dazzling sequence of imperial portraits. Charles in full armor, from 1532, now lost. Charles in brocaded coat, embroidered doublet, white breeches, stockings, and shoes, and black cap with an inappropriate white feather, possibly from 1533. Charles with the Empress Isabella, from 1538. Charles in shining armor on a prancing steed at the Battle of Mühlberg, from 1548, a glory of color and pride. Charles in somber black, seated meditative on a balcony, from 1548. It is a credit to painter and king that these portraits make no attempt to idealize their subject, except in costume. They show Charles's unprepossessing features, his bad skin, his gloomy spirit, and a certain capacity for cruelty, and yet they reveal the emperor, a man of burdens and authority, a cold, hard mind that had brought half of Western Europe under its rule. He could be kind, nevertheless, and atone handsomely for his initial miserliness. In 1533 he sent Titian a patent making him a Count Palatine and a Knight of the Golden Spur, and from that year Titian was officially court painter to the most powerful monarch in Christendom. Meanwhile, presumably through Federigo, Titian had entered into correspondence with Francesco Maria della Rovere, Duke of Urbino, who had married Eleonora Gonzaga, Federigo's sister and Isabella's daughter. Since Francesco was now commander-in-chief of the Venetian armies, he and his duchess were frequently in Venice. There Titian painted their portraits, a man 9/10 male, for Titian liked its sheen, a woman pale and resigned after many illnesses. For them, Titian painted on wood a Magdalene attractive only for the remarkable variations of light and hue that the artist gave to her auburn hair. And again for them a lovely portrait in green and brown, known only as La Bella, and now in the Pitti Gallery. For Federigo's successor, Duke Guidobaldo II, Titian made one of art's most perfect nudes, the Venus of Urbino, from circa 1538. Titian, we are told, had put some finishing touches on Giorgione's Sleeping Venus. Now he imitated that masterpiece in all but the accompaniments and the features. Here the face lacks the guileless peace of Giorgione's version, and instead of a quiet landscape we see a rich interior of green curtain, brown drape, and red couch, while two maids search for robes gorgeous enough to fitly clothe the lady's golden flesh. From Duke and Emperor, Titian passed on to paint the Pope. Paul III was also imperial, a man of virile character and subtle craft, with a face that recorded 2 generations of history. Here was a better opportunity for Titian than he had found in the uncommunicative emperor. At Bologna in 1535, Paul faced bravely the realism of Titian's portraiture. Aged 67, tired but indomitable, he sat in his flowing papal robes, the long head and large beard bent over a once powerful frame, the ring of authority conspicuous on his aristocratic hand. This and Raphael's Julius II contest the distinction of being the finest, deepest portrait of the Italian Renaissance. In 1545, the Pope invited Titian, himself now 68, to Rome. The artist was lodged in the Belvedere and received all the honors of the city. Vasari acted as his cicerone in showing him the wonders of classic and Renaissance Rome. Even Michelangelo welcomed him, and in a moment of courtesy concealed from him an opinion expressed to friends that Titian would have been a greater painter had he learned to draw. There Titian painted Paul again, older, more bent, more harassed than before, between 2 obsequious grandsons who were soon to rebel against the Pope. This, too, was among Titian's profoundest works. For one of these grandsons, Ottavio Farnese, he painted the voluptuous Danae of the Naples Museum. After 8 months in Rome, he traveled slowly back via Florence to Venice in 1546, hoping to spend his remaining days there in rest and peace. But a year later, the emperor urgently called him over the Alps to Augsburg. There he stayed 9 months, making 2 of the imperial portraits listed above, and immortalizing slim Spanish grandees and mountainous Teutons like the Elector Johann Friedrich of Saxony. On a second visit to Augsburg in 1550, Titian met the future Philip II of Spain and made several pictures of him. One of these, in the Prado, is among the master portraits of the Renaissance. Lovelier still is the likeness that he painted of Charles's Portuguese wife, the Empress Isabella. She had died in 1539, but the emperor, 4 years later, gave Titian a middling representation of her by an obscure artist and asked him to change it into a work of finished art. The result may not resemble the Empress, but even as an imaginary portrait, this Isabella of Portugal must rank high among Titian's pictures. A refined and melancholy face, a most royal costume, a book of prayers to console her premonition of an early death, a distant landscape providing overtones of green and brown and blue. Titian many times over earned his noble rank. After his return from Augsburg in 1552, Titian felt that he had traveled enough. He was 75 and doubtless thought that he had not much longer to live. Perhaps his busyness made for his longevity. Absorbed in painting after painting, he forgot to die. In a long succession of religious pictures from 1522 to 1570, he gave his own colorful and dramatic rendering of the Christian creed and story from Adam to Christ. He commemorated with powerful images the apostles and the saints. The best and most unpleasant of these is the martyrdom of St. Florence from 1558. The saint is being roasted on a gridiron by Roman soldiers and slaves, who add to his discomfort with hot irons and flagellation. These religious pictures do not move us as deeply as the similar works of the Florentines. They excel in anatomy, but give no sense of piety. One look at the athletic figures of Christ and the apostles makes it clear that Titian's interest was purely technical, that he was thinking of splendid bodies, not of ascetic saints. In the interval between the Bellini and Titian, Christianity, while still proposing topics, had lost its spiritual hold on Venetian art. That sensual element which is one requisite of pictorial or plastic art remained strong in Titian for almost a century. He repeated his Farnese Danae in several variations, and made many of Venus for defenders of the faith. Philip II of Spain was his best customer for these mythologies. The royal apartments in Madrid were adorned with a Danae, Venus and Adonis, Perseus and Andromeda, Jason and Medea, Actaeon and Diana, the Rape of Europa, Tarquin and Lucretia, Diana and Callisto, and Jupiter and Antiope, also known as the Venus of Pardo. And all but the last of these were painted by Titian after 1553, when he was 76 or more. It is encouraging to find the master's imagination creating in his 80s female nudes as perfect as those that he had portrayed in his prime. The Dianas, with their upswept auburn hair, are of the type that Veronese was using, blonde Venuses almost lovelier than any Aphrodite of the Greeks. Perhaps the same lady, grown ampler, appears in Venus with the Mirror, circa 1555, now in Washington. She is again the Venus who clings to Adonis in the Prado picture, struggling to woo him from his dogs. Not even in Correggio is there so frankly sensual a riot of feminine flesh. And there are still other Venuses scattered in the galleries, but once peopling Titian's brain. The Venus Anadyomene, from circa 1520 of Bridgewater House, standing in the bath and modestly concealed below the knees. The Venus and Cupid, from circa 1545 of the Uffizi, a Germanic blonde with impeccable hands. The clothed Venus of the Education of Cupid, from circa 1565 in the Borghese Gallery. The Prado Venus with the organ player, from circa 1545, who cannot keep his mind on his music. And a Venus with the lute player, from 1560 in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It must be said, however, that the women in these pictures are but part of their charm. Titian is interested in nature as well as women, and paints on several of these canvases splendid landscapes that are sometimes as lovely as the goddess herself. Greater and deeper than these mythological pictures are the portraits. If the Venuses display a sense of form that never grew dull, the portraits reveal in Titian an ability to seize and convey human character with a force of art unequaled in their total gallery by the combined portraits of any other hand. What could be finer than the anonymous Man with the Glove from circa 1520 in the Louvre, whose gloved left hand and delicate white ruff about the neck harmonized so well with the sensitive spirit mirrored in the eyes? Cardinal Ippolito de' Medici from 1533 in the Pitti is a less searching portrayal, and yet in the face are the subtlety, the artistic sense, the love of power that marked the Medici. The Francis I, from circa 1538 in the Louvre, made the French king's features famous, sending over the world in 100,000 reproductions the feathered hat and jolly eye and rapier nose and handsome beard and scarlet shirt of the man who lost Italy but won Leonardo and Cellini and 100 women. Titian's official post required him to paint portraits of various doges. Nearly all these portraits are lost. 3 masterly figures remain: Niccolo Marcello, who died before Titian's birth, an ugly face in a gorgeous robe; Antonio Grimani, in the picture of Faith in the Doge's palace, an ascetic face and a gorgeous robe; and Andrea Gritti, a less gorgeous robe, but a powerful face, concentrating in itself all the resolute majesty of Venice. In an opposite vein is the delicate Clarice Strozzi, which Aretino praised too fully. The portraits of Aretino in the Pitti Gallery at Florence and in the Frick collection in New York are merciless evocations of a fascinating scoundrel by his dearest friend. Tenderer is Titian's commemoration of Bembo, the poet-lover, by this time, in 1542, become a cardinal. Among the greatest portraits in Titian's gallery is the jurist Ippolito Riminaldi, from 1542, once known as the Duke of Norfolk. Disheveled brown hair, high forehead, scanty mustache and beard, firm lips, fine nose, piercing glance. We begin to understand Italy and Venice better when we see that they had such men in whom fine bodies and fine clothes were but the outward form of strong wills ready for any challenge, and penetrating minds alert to every facet of experience and art. Titian's most interesting portraits were of himself. He pictured himself several times, finally at 89. Standing before his autoritratto in the Prado, we see a face lined and yet cleaned by the flow of countless days. A skull cap not quite enclosing the white hair, a red beard almost covering the face, a large nose breathing power, blue eyes a little somber, seeing death closer than it really was, the hand grasping a brush, the great artistic passion not yet spent. This, not the doges, not the senators, not the merchants, was the Lord of Venice for half a century, giving immortality to transient aristocrats and kings, and raising his adopted city to a place beside Florence and Rome in the history of the Renaissance. He was a rich man now, though the memory of early insecurity made him acquisitive to the end. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.